In the morning, Joakim drove the children to Marnus as usual, and when he got home, the house was silent and empty. At around 1 o'clock, he heard a car engine. A large wine-red Mercedes was driving up the gravel track at high speed. Katrine's mother had come to visit. Joakim took a deep breath, then went to open the kitchen door. "Hi there, Mira. I'm glad you're home. How are you?" "Not so great. I can understand that. This sort of thing makes you feel like shit." That was all the sympathy he got from her. He stepped aside and she swept past in a miasma of tobacco and perfume. In the kitchen, Mira took an apple out of the bowl and went on, "So, when are you coming to Kalmar to visit me?" "I didn't know we were invited." "Of course you are." She bit into the apple. "Come whenever you like." "Katrine never got an invitation, as far as I know," said Joakim. "Katrine wouldn't have come anyway. But we called each other sometimes." "Once a year," Joakim corrected her. "She rang you at Christmas, but she always closed the door when she was on the phone to you." Mira shook her head. "I talked to her just a month ago." "What about?" "Nothing special." She wandered further into the house, but stopped at the Ramba painting outside Joakim's bedroom. "I gave this to Katrine for her 20th birthday," she said. "Something to remember her grandmother by." "She really liked it." "It shouldn't be hanging here," said Mira. "The last picture by Turan that was sold at auction went for 300,000 kroner." "Really? But nobody knows we've got it here." Mira stared intently at the picture, following the grey-black lines of the oil paints with her eyes. "There are no horizontal lines at all. That's why it's so difficult to look at," she said. "This is the way you paint if you've been out in the blizzard." "And Turan had?" "Yes. It was our first winter here. They had issued a warning about snowstorms, but Turan went off anyway. She liked walking inland and then sitting down to paint. She had problems with her eyesight after that. That was when it started. And of course she went blind in the end." "Because of the blizzard?" "She couldn't open her eyes for several days. The blizzard lifted sand from the fields and mixed it with the snow. It was like having pins stuck in your eyes." "How many of Turan's paintings were there to start with?" he asked. "A lot. There must have been 50. "And now there are only 6, is that right?" "6, yes." Mira's expression was grim. "The 6 that were saved." "And people say," Mira interrupted crossly, "I know what people say. They say I put them in the stove one cold winter and burned them so we wouldn't freeze to death." "Katrine said that wasn't true," said Joakim. "Katrine was born the year after it happened, so she wasn't there." Mira sighed. "I hear the gossip here on the island. Mira Ramba is a difficult old woman. Her boyfriends are far too young for her. She's an alcoholic. I suppose that's what Katrine said as well?" Joakim shook his head, but he remembered how Mira had staggered around at their wedding in Borgholm, trying to seduce his younger cousin. She took a last long look at the house. "I might come again," she said. "You do that," said Joakim. The evening after Mira Ramba's visit, the family were invited to their neighbours at the farm to the south. 7-year-old Andreas had joined them at the dinner table before he and the Weston children went into the kitchen for some ice cream. Joakim stayed in the dining room, drinking coffee with Roger and Maria Carlson. He eventually asked, "I wonder if you've heard any stories about our place, about Eel Point?" "Stories?" said Roger Carlson. "Yes, ghost stories or other tales," said Joakim. "She didn't talk to me about any ghosts," said Roger. "She did talk to me about it when she came over for coffee," said Maria. "She was just wondering whether Eel Point had a bad reputation." She looked at her husband. "I mean, when we were little, the adults used to talk about a secret room at Eel Point that was haunted. Do you remember, Roger?" Her husband just shook his head, but Joakim leaned forward. "Where was this room? Do you know?" "No idea," said Roger, drinking his coffee. "No, I don't know either," said Maria. "But my grandfather said something about the ghosts haunting this room every Christmas. The dead gathered in a particular room, and then they took—" "That's just ridiculous nonsense," said Roger, picking up the coffee pot and offering it to Joakim. "More coffee?" Tilda Davidson lay naked and sweaty. Martin was sitting on the edge of the bed with his back to her. Tilda should have realized what was coming, but she didn't. He had sat down on the edge of the bed and was looking out of the window. "I don't think we can do this," he said eventually. "Do what?" "This. All this. It's not working." He was still looking out of the window. "Karen's asking questions." "About what?" Tilda still didn't realize she was in the process of being dumped. Screwed and then dumped. Classic. She heard the door close and footsteps disappearing down the stairs. He would go out to his car in the square and drive home to his family as if nothing had happened. After feeling sorry for herself for more than half an hour, Tilda got up. She had a shower, got dressed, and decided to go over to the home to see Gerloff. But before she could set off, the telephone rang. It was the duty officer in Borgholm. There had been a break-in at a vicarage north of Manus. Work dulled Tilda's pain. When they had finished at the vicarage, Tilda got into her car and drove down to the home where Gerloff lived. "A break-in," said Tilda, to explain why she was late. "Really?" said Gerloff. "Where?" "The vicarage at Haggleby. They beat up the owner." "Have you been looking for traces of the people who did it?" Tilda nodded. "Could you get me a piece of paper from the desk?" Tilda did as he asked and looked on silently as Gerloff wrote a few short lines on the piece of paper. Then he handed it to her. There were 3 names in Gerloff's neat handwriting. John Hagman, Dagmar Carlson, Edla Gustafsson. Tilda looked up at Gerloff. "Okay," she said. "Are these the burglars?" "No, they're old friends of mine." "Right." "They can help you," said Gerloff. "How?" "They see things." "Okay." "They all live near the road, and they keep an eye on the traffic," said Gerloff. "Start with John, down in Stiernik. We're friends. Say hello from me." "And ask about strange cars," said Tilda. "Exactly." Livia had developed a new sleep pattern. She would sleep peacefully for 2 nights, but on the 3rd night she would become restless. "Daddy!" At least there was some progress, thought Joakim, as he went towards his daughter's room. She no longer called out for Katrine. He sat down on the edge of Livia's bed and stroked her back, waiting for her to start talking. After a couple of minutes she began. "Daddy?" "Yes," he answered quietly. "Can you see anyone, Livia?" She was still lying with her back to him. "Mummy," she said. He was prepared now. "Where is she?" he asked. "Does Mummy want to say anything to me?" No reply. "Where is she?" he asked again. "Where's Mummy, Livia?" Still no reply. What was Mummy doing on the jetty? Why did she go down to the sea? She wanted to find out. Find out what? The truth. The truth? Who from? Livia was silent. "Where's Mummy now?" he asked. "Close." "Is she in the house?" Livia didn't respond. "Can you talk to her now?" he asked. "Is she listening?" "She's watching." "Can she see us?" "Maybe." Joakim held his breath. He searched for the right questions. "What can you see now, Livia?" "There's someone on the shore, by the lighthouses." "That must be Mummy. Has she—" "No," said Livia. "Ethel." "What?" "It's Ethel." Joakim went completely cold. "No," he said. "That can't be her name." "Yes." "No, Livia." He had raised his voice. "Yes, Ethel wants to talk." Joakim was still sitting on the bed, incapable of moving. I don't want to talk," he said. "Not to her." "She wants—" "No," said Joakim quickly. His heart was pounding, his mouth was dry. "Ethel can't be here." Livia was silent again. He couldn't breathe anymore, he just wanted to escape from this room. But he stayed there on the edge of Livia's bed, stiff and terrified. In the end, he managed to stand up and forced himself to go out into the dark corridor and crept back to bed. On Saturday, the family had visitors, their former neighbours from Stockholm, Lisa and Michael Heslin. They had called a few days earlier and asked if they could stay over on Åland on their way back from Denmark. Joakim had been pleased. Both he and Katrine had enjoyed having Lisa and Michael as their neighbours. After they had all gone to bed, Joakim lay in the darkness, listening to the murmur of Lisa and Michael's voices from the guest room. It felt really good to have them here. Eel Point needed more guests. Living guests. After a few minutes, there was silence in the house. Joakim closed his eyes and fell asleep. Loud cries could be heard throughout the house. Joakim woke up with a start, and an instant thought, Livia? No, it was a man's voice. It was Michael Heslin calling out in the darkness. Joakim got out of bed. The light was on in the hallway, and when he got there, Lisa was just putting on her coat and boots. He stood by the window with his cup and saw Lisa sitting next to Michael in the car. It was snowing lightly. Lisa seemed to be asking Michael questions. He was sitting behind the wheel, just staring out through the windscreen and shaking his head. After a few minutes, Lisa came back inside. She looked at Joakim. Michael had a nightmare. He says someone was standing next to the bed, watching him. Is he coming back inside? I think he wants to stay in the car for a while, said Lisa, and added, I think we'll probably drive down and stay the night at the hotel in Borgholm. He has been a bit on edge. Work isn't going too well right now. He doesn't say much about it, but... Quarter of an hour later, Joakim was back at the kitchen window, watching the Heslins' big car driving away. He climbed back into bed and lay there in the darkness, his eyes open. On Monday morning, he drove the children into Manus. At around 2 o'clock, he made some coffee and noticed that the door to the barn was half open. Hadn't he closed it on Friday, before the Heslins arrived? It was 20 steps over to the barn. Joakim pushed the huge door open wide and stepped into the darkness. The old black switch was in the middle of the shorter wall. When he turned it, 2 small bulbs spread a pale yellow light across the stone floor, the empty stalls and feeding troughs. Everything was silent. Every time he came in here, he discovered something new, and now he noticed that the floor near the door looked as if it had been freshly swept. Katrine had mentioned something about the fact that she had been cleaning the barn when they were discussing the various buildings in the autumn. Joakim looked over towards the wooden steps up to the hayloft. When he got up there, he could see the rays of the sun shining in through the small panes on the southern side of the barn. Joakim moved slowly across the floor. Finally, he was standing in front of the far wall. As he stood beside the broad planks, he had a sense of darkness behind them. He suddenly got the feeling that this was not in fact the outside wall of the barn. Despite the fact that it was almost time to go and pick up Livia and Gabriel, he quickly went outside again. He took a few steps away from the barn and counted the small windows on the upper floor. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then he went up into the loft again. There were 4 windows, high up below the roof. The last one must be on the other side of the wall. There was no door or gap in the wall. Joakim pressed several of the thick planks, but none of them moved. Edla Gustafsson lived near Spetby, and the main road went right past her house. She seemed pleased to have a visit from a relative of Gerlof. Edla was cheerful and energetic, hardly bothering to listen to Tilda's explanation of why she was there. I have 1 or 2 questions, Edla. I don't know if you've seen the newspaper, but there has been a break-in with serious violence in Huggleby, and the police could do with some help. I've had a break-in as well, said Edla. They got into the garage and took a petrol can. Really? Said Tilda. And when was this? It was the autumn of 73. OK, but we're looking at more recent break-ins at the moment, over the last few months. Gerlof tells me that you keep an eye on the traffic. There are so many nowadays. I don't write down the numbers anymore. But have you seen any cars you didn't recognize over the past few days? Late at night, last Friday, for example? Edla gave it some thought. A big black car came past here last Thursday. It was heading north. Like a van? Was it late at night? Yes. It was just before 12, after I'd switched the lights off, in the bedroom. A big black van. That's what it was. Good. Did it look new or old? Not particularly new, and there was some kind of writing on the side. Kalmar, and something to do with welding. Tilda made a note of that. Great. Thank you so much for your help. Will there be a reward if you catch them? Tilda lowered her notepad and shook her head sadly. After lunch, Tilda spent almost 3 hours at the local school talking about law and order with the pupils. She had several traffic reports to write up when she got back to the station, but couldn't quite let go of the drowning at Eel Point. She collected her thoughts, then picked up the telephone and rang the manor house. Joakim Westin picked up. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Did your wife know anyone who has a boat here on Åland? A boat owner close to your place?" "I don't know anyone at all who has a boat here," said Westin. "And Katrine, she never mentioned anyone with a boat either." "Did she ever have any visitors?" "Only me, as far as I know." "OK, thanks," said Tilda. "I'll be in touch if—" "I have a question too," Westin interrupted her. "Yes?" "When you were here, you said something about a relative of yours who knew Eel Point." "That's right. Gerlof," said Tilda. "He's my grandfather's brother. I'd really like to have a chat with him." "About the manor?" "About its history and about a particular story concerning Eel Point." "I can ask," said Tilda. "Gerlof usually likes telling stories." "Tell him he's very welcome to come over." It was a new month, the month of Christmas, and it was Friday afternoon. Joakim had returned to the hayloft in the ice-cold barn and was standing in front of the wall. In his hands he held a hammer and a newly sharpened chisel. He had gone up into the loft an hour or so before he was due to pick up Livia and Gabriel. On the left, in the corner, a deep split ran along one of the middle planks. He pushed the chisel into the crack, hit it with the hammer, and the sharp metal went straight through the wood. All it took was a dozen or so hard blows with the hammer to loosen the end of the plank. It fell inwards, and the dull thud when it landed proved that the wooden floor continued on the other side of the wall. But it was impossible to see what was in there. When Joakim bent down to look through the hole, just a couple of inches wide, a definite smell struck him. It rushed towards his face, making him close his eyes and lean against the wall. It was Katrine's smell. He got down on his knees and pushed his left hand into the opening. First his fingers, then his wrist, and finally the whole of his forearm. He groped about, but he could feel nothing. But when he lowered his fingers, they touched something in there, something soft. It felt like coarse fabric, like someone's jeans or jacket. Joakim quickly withdrew his hand. The next moment he heard a dull rumbling on the track outside, and a beam of light illuminated the windows of the barn white with frost. A car was driving into the courtyard. In the courtyard he was dazzled by the headlights. "Hi there, Joakim." It was a brisk voice that he recognized, Marianne, the head of the preschool. "Has something happened?" she asked. He stared at her in confusion. He had forgotten to pick up Gabriel and Livia. "I forgot what time it was." "It's okay," said Marianne. I was just so worried that something might have happened. I tried to call, but there was no reply." "Thanks," said Joakim. "Thanks for bringing them home." When she had reversed out of the courtyard, Joakim went inside, feeling ashamed of himself. He boiled some water for pasta and warmed the sauce. Several times he glanced out of the window. The barn loomed up on the far side of the courtyard like a black castle. It had secrets, a hidden room without a door. That night, Joakim called his former neighbours in Stockholm, Lisa and Michael Heslin. He hadn't heard a word from them since the night they left Eel Point. "Hi, Joakim," said Michael. "You in Stockholm?" "No, we're still on Åland. How are things?" "Fine. Good to hear from you." And yet Joakim thought Michael sounded wary. "I just wanted to check up, make sure everything was okay. I mean, it was a bit of a hasty departure last time you came down here." "Yes," said Michael, and hesitated before going on. "Sorry about that." "Lisa thought you'd had a nightmare," said Joakim, "that you dreamed someone was standing by the bed." "Did she say that? I don't remember." "You don't remember who you saw?" "No. I've never seen anything strange around here," said Joakim, "but I've felt things sometimes. And out in the barn I've found—" "So, what about the renovation?" Michael interrupted him. "How's all that going?" "What? Have you finished the wallpapering?" "No, not quite." Joakim realized that Michael had no desire whatsoever to discuss unusual experiences or bad dreams. The conversation didn't last much longer. "There's a hidden room at Eel Point," said Joakim to Katrine's mother, Mira Ramba. "A room without a door." "Really?" Where? Up in the hayloft. It's big. I've paced out the barn, and the floor of the loft stops almost 4 yards before the outside wall. He looked at Mira. You didn't know? She shook her head. Mira lived in a spacious apartment close to the cathedral in Kalmar and had invited Joakim over for dinner. One of the police officers in Manus wants to carry on with the investigation, said Joakim. She's called me a couple of times. I know why she died, said Mira, drawing on her cigarette. Joakim looked up. You do? It was the house. The house? Mira laughed briefly, but she wasn't smiling. That damned house is full of unhappiness, she said. It's destroyed the lives of every family that has ever lived there. Joakim looked at her, surprised by the comment. You can't blame unhappiness on a house. Mira stubbed out her cigarette. Joakim changed the subject. I'm having a visitor next week, a pensioner who knows the house. His name is Gerlof Davidson. Have you met him? Mira shook her head. But I think his brother lived close by, she said. Ragnar. I met him. Anyway, Gerlof is going to tell me about the history of Eel Point. How did you end up at Eel Point, he asked. You and your mother. The rent was low, said Mira. Joakim thought for a while, then asked, Did Katrine ever talk to you about Ethel? No. Who's Ethel? She was my older sister. She died last year, almost exactly a year ago. She was a user. I've never really been into drugs, said Mira, but drugs can open doors in your mind. Joakim stared at her. He thought of Ethel's blank expression and realized why Katrine had never told Mira about her. It was Wednesday, the second week in December, and Tilda and Gerlof were on their way out to Eel Point for coffee. Gerlof and the owner of the manor were to meet at last. Joakim Weston opened the door after the second knock. After a tour of the house, they sat down in the kitchen with a cup of coffee. Tilda said you wanted to hear some stories about the manor, said Gerlof. I'd like that, said Joakim. If there are any. Oh, there are, said Gerlof. But I suppose you mean ghost stories? Joakim hesitated, then said, I'd just like to know if anyone else has experienced unusual things here. I've felt, or imagined I've felt, the presence of the dead at Eel Point, both out by the lighthouses and here inside the manor. Whatever you might feel of the dead, or whatever you think you might see, said Gerlof slowly, it can be dangerous to let them rule our actions. Yes, said Joakim quietly, and to try to call them up, or ask questions. Questions? You never know what answers you might get, said Gerlof. Joakim looked down into his coffee cup and nodded. But I have wondered about this story that says they will return here. Who? The dead. When I was having coffee with the neighbours, they told me a story. Those who have died here at the manor return home every Christmas. I was just wondering if there were any more tales about that. Oh, that's an old story, said Gerlof. It's told in many places. Later they were outside saying goodbye. You have a beautiful home out here, said Gerlof. But be careful of the blizzard. It doesn't come every year, but I'm pretty sure it'll come this winter. And it comes quickly. You don't want to be outdoors down here by the sea when that happens. Especially not the children. Okay, said Joakim with a smile. We'll be careful. You do that. Gerlof nodded and set off towards the car, supported by Tilda. But he suddenly stopped. What was your wife wearing on the day of her accident? Joakim Weston stopped, smiling. Boots, jeans, and a winter jacket. Could I take a look at them? Okay, but they're still all parcelled up, said Joakim. I'll go and get them. He went back into the house. When Tilda had started the engine and driven out through the gate, Gerlof leaned back in his seat. What was all that business with the clothes? Said Tilda. Why did you want to borrow them? Gerlof looked out through the windscreen. I'll tell you more very soon, when I've looked at the clothes. After the break-in at Hagleby Vicarage and the flight through the forest, it was 2 weeks before the Sorelius brothers came back to Borgholm. But suddenly, there they were at Henrik's door one evening, at the worst possible moment. because by that time the quiet but rhythmic knocking in his flat had started to become intolerable. Every night he wandered back and forth between the bedroom and the kitchen, terrified of going to bed and turning out the light. In sheer desperation, he had called Camilla, his ex-girlfriend. They hadn't been in touch for several months, but she sounded pleased to hear from him. They had talked for almost an hour. Henrik's nerves were at breaking point when his doorbell rang 3 days later, and the sight of Tommy and Freddie at the door didn't exactly make him feel any better. Tommy was wearing sunglasses, and his hands were twitching. He wasn't smiling. It wasn't a friendly reunion. "You want money?" said Tommy. "Don't you?" Henrik sighed. "It's not the money that's the problem. It's all the stolen stuff in the boathouse. We need to get it sold." "We'll sell it," said Tommy. "But first we're going to do one more trip. The last trip to the north, to the manor house." "What manor house?" "The one with all the paintings. The one Alistair told us about." "Eel Point," said Henrik quietly. "That's the one." That night he lay alone in his bed, and when he had turned out the light, the noises started in the hallway. There was a knocking sound inside the walls, quiet but persistent. Henrik raised his head from the pillow. "Shut up!" he yelled out into the room. The knocking stopped, then resumed.